Welcome to another edition of SOS America. I'm Charles Feldman. Thank you again for watching or listening, or maybe both, to this podcast. If you have over the past few months, you know that we have different guests and we talk about basically what is happening now in the United States. It's designed, this podcast, primarily for people outside the U.S. who are trying to figure out what's going on here. But of course, anybody in the United States who wants to watch or listen, you are more than welcome to join this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something that might sound at first somewhat off topic for a podcast that is about primarily politics, but I think you will come to see that it is very much a part of what we have been talking about these past several months. So joining us today on SOS America is Daniel K. Williams. He is an associate professor of history at Ashland University. Professor, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
May I be presumptuous and call you Dan for the sake of brevity?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. All right. Then again, Dan, thanks for being with us. I mentioned at the outset that this may seem off topic for a podcast about politics, but I think you will agree with me that it is very much a part of politics, at least the way it is playing out now in the United States. Am I right about that?
Yes, I think so. I guess in the United States, so much of our political division falls along religious lines. And so a religious revival would definitely have political implications.
Okay, and that is, of course, the topic, which is conservative Christianity. And I was fascinated by a piece that you recently wrote in, I believe it was the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Um, and it made me start thinking about this being an area that often I think is regrettably overlooked by mainstream media, that for whatever reason tends to shy away from stories that relate to religion, and maybe that's because they think that it's going to alienate some parts of the audience. I'm not quite sure why, but I do think that that is an issue. So I did find it very interesting to read, and so I hope that we can explore that more now within this podcast. So let me start off by asking you to kind of set up the scenario, if you will. What do we mean, first of all? What do you mean by conservative Christianity? And what does it mean here in the United States?
Yeah, well, increasingly in the United States, it means the vast majority of American Christians. Traditionally, over the past century, Protestantism has been divided between what is often called the main line, sometimes called liberal Protestantism, and a more theologically conservative wing called evangelicalism. And for roughly the first half of the century after that division in the 1920s, it looked like the main line was in the ascendancy. The mainline Protestants controlled most of American educational institutions. They controlled significant part of other cultural institutions as well, and their denominations were still growing and in some cases larger than most of evangelicalism. But since the late 1960s, that has reversed. And in fact, in the last decade and a half or so, the decline of the main line, the numerical decline of the main line, has accelerated. So today, the majority of American Protestant churches would probably align themselves not with the old mainline denominations like the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church USA or now the United Methodist Church, but rather with either evangelical denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention or increasingly simply just hanging out a shingle and calling yourself a non-denominational church. Also in Catholicism, while over the past 60 years, a significant part of American Catholicism has been politically liberal, sometimes even culturally liberal, increasingly younger Catholic converts are gravitating toward a more culturally and politically conservative expression of Catholicism. So, by conservative Christianity, what I mean is a form of Christianity that would align not with the main line, not with liberal theological presuppositions, but would generally take a traditionally conservative view of biblical authority, in the case of Catholics, a traditionally conservative view of church authority, uh, that would include, among other things, obviously lining up with the ancient creeds, but more than that, uh, looking to religious texts, religious institutions as a source of authority. And while it's not in any way required that that would go along with conservative politics, for various reasons, in the United States, it generally has, both in the past and even more so in the present. That today, if we look at evangelical Protestants, for example, uh, at least 80% of white evangelical Protestant voters have supported Donald Trump over the past three election cycles. And among conservative Catholics, it's not quite at that percentage, but nevertheless, the majority of white Catholics have also voted Republican. So there does seem to be a correspondence in general between theological conservatism and what we would call political conservatism. Certainly, the Republican Party today, if that's our measure of political conservatism, there seems to be this correspondence between the two.
All right. Let me first of all ask, is this something, this trend, maybe that's too flippant a way to describe it as a trend, but for lack of a better word, is this just here in the United States, or is this a global phenomenon?
Well, the religious revival seems to be a phenomenon that has international implications. So, in both England and France, there have been signs of the beginning of a Gen Z religious revival. Now, in both of those countries, the percentage of the percentage of the population that regularly went to church was so low that it would take a considerable religious revival to reach the levels of religiosity that we're seeing in the United States. So when we're talking about a religious revival among uh, college students and that age group in parts of Europe, we're talking about a considerably smaller phenomenon in terms of absolute numbers, but actually potentially a larger phenomenon in terms of percentages, because, say, if only 2% of Gen Zers went to church last year, and today it's 4%, to use somewhat hypothetical numbers, you have a doubling in the church attendance rate. And so that's the type of religious revival that we're seeing in in England and other parts of Europe. So there are signs that this may be a transnational phenomenon. Whether it would have political implications in the same way, though, is a bit more uncertain. And I think the answer is that there would not be necessarily a one-to-one correspondence, that the political situation in other countries is such that we don't have what we have in the United States, which is a long-standing, decades-long alliance between a particular wing of Christianity and a political party. So the alliance between the Republican Party and conservative Christians did not start with this revival. Certainly, it goes back several decades, and that's not as true in other countries.
Why did this alliance in the United States happen?
Well, I think there were multiple causes for it. The alliance seems to have gained national attention with the election of 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan. But actually, if you go back a few years before that to 1972, uh, Richard Nixon carried the votes of more than three-quarters of uh, evangelical Protestants at that time and enjoyed what seemed to be a fairly close political friendship with Billy Graham. He enjoyed the strong support of some evangelical magazines at the time. So even before the rise of the moral majority in 1979 and the alliance between the Reagan campaign and white evangelicals, there was already in place the basis for an alliance between some groups of conservative Christians and the Republican Party. But I would say that accelerated in the late 1970s. And some of the reasons for that were that conservative evangelicals perceived that they were losing their hold on the culture. That before the 1960s, they had perceived that national politicians, even the court system, certainly the culture at large, tended to be more supportive of conservative Christian values than they felt that it was after the late 1960s. And so, in some ways, the rise of the religious right in the late 1970s was a reaction against the second wave feminism, the sexual revolution, threats that conservative Christians perceived to the family. Certainly, abortion played a role in that for conservative Catholics. Oftentimes, that was the issue that brought them into conservative politics. For conservative evangelicals, it may have been less prominent in the 1970s, though it would become their number one issue in the 1980s. But in short, while there were a lot of different individual single issue campaigns that fed into the religious right, a lot of individual leaders, I think if we had to summarize all of it, we would say that conservative evangelicals and to a certain extent conservative Catholics in the 1970s perceived that a culture that had been friendly to them was no longer as friendly to them. And they felt that they could change the direction of that culture by using the political process to pass legislation or to change the direction of the Supreme Court that would empower conservative Christians to have a greater degree of cultural influence that would protect the family.
Is there something in the DNA, if you will, of the United States that makes possible this sort of religion political alliance? Is there something unique to the fabric of America that makes this maybe inevitable?
Yeah, I think there is. I don't know about inevitable, but I would say that there's something unique in American DNA. And that started, I would say, with the fact that the United States was an early leader on the world stage of granting full freedom of religion. There was church disestablishment that was baked into America's constitutional DNA, with both the prohibition on religious tests for public office in the Constitution, but even more importantly, the First Amendment, which protected freedom of religion, prevented the state from establishing a religion at the national level. And so while that seemed to a few Christians in the late 18th century to be a bit of a blow, that is, there had been established churches in the colonies before the Revolution. Actually, as some historians like Nathan Hatch have pointed out, it created a free religious marketplace. And for people who believe that competition in any industry fosters innovation, that's a principle of the free market, it's perhaps no surprise, whether you're a religious believer or not, that a free religious marketplace would foster religious innovation that would meet consumer demands. And so that's exactly what has happened in American history. The forms of Christianity that are popular today would in some cases be unrecognizable to the founding fathers. That is, at the time that the Constitution was written in 1787, or the Bill of Rights ratified in 1791, Catholics made up only about 1% of the American population. They were a very small beleaguered minority. Pentecostalism was completely unknown. It was more than a century in the future. And the forms of evangelical megachurches that are popular today also would be a very far cry from any form of church that the the founders were familiar with. And conversely, the denominational descendants of the largest denominations in the late 18th century, the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians, are not doing particularly well. They still exist, but they collectively account for less than 2% of the American population. And so if we had had a religious establishment, which undoubtedly would have been either Anglican or Congregationalist in the late 18th century, it's highly likely, I think, that the United States would have experienced a disillusionment with institutional Christianity that would parallel that of European countries that have also had a religious establishment that has become less popular. But because from the very beginning of the country, the mechanism was put into place for religious competition, the United States not only could experience the rise of all sorts of new denominations and sectarian groups, ranging from the Mormons to various strange religious movements that quickly disappeared, but had their heyday, utopian communities and other such groups. Not only that, but we also saw the rise of new forms of Christianity that would be perhaps considered a little bit more theologically orthodox and that would have long staying power. So the rise of an evangelical revival in the Second Great Awakening, for example, and the emergence of new denominations that were perhaps outgrowths of earlier movements, but that became far more popular, like the Wesleyan movements and the various groups of Baptists that really took hold of the American religious landscape in the 19th century. Those are, of course, still with us today. And in turn, with each generation, we've had new expressions of American religion, sometimes radically new, sometimes just slightly innovative, that somehow meet the needs of the market. Now, beyond that, what I would say is, okay, so we have all of this privatized American religion, but how did it become politicized? Well, American political arguments have largely been moral at some level. We've debated slavery in the early 19th century to such an extent, of course, that it split the country in a civil war. In the 1960s, civil rights. More recently, we've had debates about abortion. We've had debates about LGBTQ rights and various definitions of gender. And so because Americans have been a religious people with competing ideas about how to apply religious principles, a lot of those social aspects of religion spill over into our political debates. And because of the Electoral College, we have tended to always have a two-party system. There have been numerous third parties, but very few of those have had much influence on the political landscape. Instead, unlike most Western democracies, we're pretty much locked into two parties. And with all of these moral debates going on, what in other countries might be fragmented into a multi-party debate with maybe a very small Christian Democratic Party as exists in some parts of Europe. Instead, we have these lobbying factions that if the cards are right, so to speak, if the stars align, they can capture control of a political party. And to a large extent, that's what has happened with the religious right. The religious right doesn't control the entire Republican Party, but it certainly has, for the past 45 years, had a controlling interest in the Republican Party. It's been a major player in the party to such an extent that it would be impossible for any Republican politician to get the presidential nomination of that party without in some way dealing with the religious right.
All right. So I grew up in New York City, largely in the 60s and 70s, early 80s. By then, I was an adult and on my way. But my take, and maybe it was a wrong take because of where I grew up in New York City, but my sense then was religion, for the most part, was not a big factor for young people, for people who were then my age, people in their 20s, even early 30s. Religion, just unless you happen to be someone who grew up in a particularly religious home, it was just not something that was talked about. It was certainly not something that would be a private conversation, among friends. You would talk about lots of things, but certainly not religion, at least not in my recollection. And again, now I take it that New York City is very different from many parts of the United States, always has been. So maybe that was an incorrect perception that I had because of where I grew up. But uh, if we take it, for the sake of argument, that maybe that perception that I had was not that odd or wrong in that period of time, then that leads to the question, what has changed? Because in the article that I referred to at the outset that you wrote for the Times, you were particularly talking about a younger generation, as I recall, right? Gen
Mhm.
Z, which would be for those who have lost track of this alphabet soup of generations. Gen Z would be roughly people born between when and when?
Roughly 1997, excuse me, 1997 to 2012. And of course, when we're talking about uh, Gen Zers making decisions, we're not necessarily talking about the people born in 2012. Uh,
Yeah.
but we could say people who are college aged up through approximately the age of 28, so 18 to 28-year-olds.
Okay, so that is kind of the age range that I was referring to when I was growing up in New York City, where religion was the farthest thing from my mind or the minds, I dare say, of my friends and acquaintances. So, what has changed? Has anything changed? And if so, what changed?
Yeah. Well, I think there has been a change of sorts, and so I think your perception is not incorrect about the 70s and 80s. It is true that if you had been born, say, in the South, had grown up in the South, maybe you would have experienced, if not a fervent religious conversion on the part of your friends, at least more familiarity with religion in the Bible Belt. But that aside, I think Christian Smith, the sociologist Christian Smith's analysis does show that for both Gen Xers and millennials, there was a general move away from religion. And in fact, it wasn't that long ago, I would say maybe only a year or two ago, that we were still seeing so many headlines about the rise of the nuns and predictions that just as we had seen a move away from religion in the late 90s and early 21st century, and that seemed to be continuing unabated, and that just as Gen Xers and and millennials were moving away from religion, so undoubtedly would the Gen Zers. And then more recently, very recently, we started to see several statistics showing that maybe that's not the case, that maybe there's actually a religious revival among Gen Zers. Now, I think it's important not to exaggerate the change because I'm not claiming, nor do the statistics say, that a majority of Gen Zers are experiencing religious conversions or are expressing interest in religion. In fact, some statistics show that perhaps as many as 53% of Gen Zers never go to church. That those numbers, depending on the survey and how the question is asked, could range from about 38 to 53%. But we could say
Yeah,
a
but you
fairly
could be,
large
yeah,
contingent.
but let me interrupt you because you can certainly be religious and not go to church.
Uh, you can, although usually what people in that category call themselves more likely is spiritual but not religious.
Hmm.
But yes, I mean a person could call themselves religious and identify with a religious institution even if not being part of it. More likely though, they would identify as having a spirituality but not really supporting an institution. And
Yeah.
by the way, when I say, more than a third of Gen Zers, maybe half of Gen Zers never go to church, and I've called them non-religious. That certainly doesn't mean they're atheists. Most of them are not, and many of them may have spiritual beliefs that are very important to them. But nevertheless, that group that doesn't go to church is much less likely to be politically conservative, much less likely to subscribe to the tenets of theologically orthodox Christianity. But there's also a group that's a roughly a quarter of Gen Zers who are highly religious. They attend church, 24% attend church roughly weekly. Similar surveys show that maybe up to 30% would share beliefs that people would call Christian nationalist. Roughly 25% as well identify as Republican. Those are not synonymous. There are people who go to church that don't identify as Republican, and there are people who are Republican that don't go to church. But nevertheless, what we can say with all of these statistics is that maybe a quarter of Gen Zers would fall pretty comfortably into the category that we've traditionally called the Christian right, and give or take a few percentage points, and that furthermore, the direction is toward that that wing. That is, there's a Harvard study that showed that between 2022 and 2023, the percentage of Gen Zers identifying as Catholic increased by 6 percentage points, from 15 to 21%, which implies this astonishingly high rate of conversion. And that's backed up by a lot of anecdotal evidence as well. There are numerous priests who have reported young people, particularly young men, coming to them and expressing interest in joining the Catholic Church. So there's definitely something happening. It's happening among a minority of Gen Zers, but I think what that shows is that we're poised for both continued cultural conflict over all of the Christian right issues in the future, and also, I think, poised for the continued saliency of conservative Christianity among the younger generation. Because if it's a minority viewpoint, but a very strong minority viewpoint, it has the potential to, first of all, be well known to just about every Gen Zer. That is, even if a lot of Gen Zers are not personally conservative Christians, they'll know a conservative Christian among their age group. It's a large enough contingent that they'll be aware of it if it's 1 out of 4. But secondly, that group that identifies as conservative Christians will perceive themselves as a minority, and quite likely a beleaguered, embattled minority. So that actually fits very well into the narrative that conservative Christians have been telling about themselves, have been believing about themselves, and is likely to give rise to the continued maintenance of that group identity.
Is this more of in terms of gender, a male phenomenon as opposed to a female one? And if
Yes,
that's why?
and it is very unusual. So again, I think it's important not to overstate this, because when you look at the numbers, the percentages are actually fairly evenly divided. It's a little bit. It's less than a 55-45 split. Somewhere between 50 and 55% male. So that's not a huge gender difference. But what's astonishing is that there's a gender difference at all, because for 200 years we've been used to both evangelical churches and Catholic churches being disproportionately female. That was remarked upon in the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century. And ever since we've been keeping statistics in the 20th century and beyond, the percentage of women who go to church regularly has always been higher than the percentage of men.
But something fundamentally has changed then, right?
Yes.
Is it, and let me ask, do you think that this has anything to do, or is it just something that's running parallel to the fact that a lot of other statistics are showing that there's a lot of discontent and uncertainty among young men in America at this time? There's uncertainty about job opportunities. There's uncertainty because of feminism, perhaps, about what the role of a male is in American society. Does that have anything to do you think, with this change? And it is a change, right?
Mhm.
Where men, young men, are becoming more religious, and that is not something that we've seen, as you just pointed out, in the history of this country.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are great questions. And I think the answer to that is probably yes. It's difficult to tease out from the statistics alone, what might be going on. Uh, but if I could speculate a bit and, engage in a
Sure.
cultural
Yeah.
analysis that perhaps would explain this, what I would say is that, there are probably several things going on. So first of all, one of the things that has affected this entire generation, uh, whether male or female, of course, is COVID. It was enormously disruptive. It, I think we're probably only beginning to grapple with the long-term trauma that has resulted from this. But both men and women in college are much more likely today to say they need uh, psychological help than college students were 20 years ago. Uh, and so there's a longing for community. There's a longing for relationships that were perhaps disrupted by COVID, also just disrupted by the electronic media that we have in general, by the phenomenon of social media. And so, but beyond that, some things that I think have uniquely affected men have been that over the past 10 years, there has been a shift in Americans' uh, understanding of gender, particularly on the left. And while some men have embraced that, a number of men who don't identify as gay or transgender have tended to feel like liberalism doesn't have very much to offer them. And when coupled with COVID, where they saw, in many cases, from their own perception, they would say liberalism failed. That is, liberalism failed to sustain the economy. Liberalism failed in its predictions of what was supposed to happen with COVID and the COVID protocols. That, I think, has led to an unusually strong distrust of science and institutions in general among Gen Zers. Before COVID, already there was strong suspicion of a lot of traditional institutions in this country. But I think after COVID, added to all of that was a renewed or new or even new distrust in science, and we can see that in the popularity of conspiracy theories among Gen Zers that I think to people of a slightly older generation, maybe our generation, would have seemed laughable and ridiculous, like the idea that the moon landing was a hoax or other things that
Yeah.
have actually gained quite a lot of salience among people of a younger generation. And so,
But but
in
but
the
but
midst
but,
of that,
but let me interject here, because I think it's an important point. What was it about the pandemic that would lead a younger generation to be distrustful of science?
Mhm.
Was it because what, when the vaccines came out, maybe the government oversold it and people thought you got the vaccine, you're not going to get COVID, and it turned out that that really wasn't the case. The vaccines prevented serious illness, but didn't necessarily prevent infection. Was that it? I mean, what was it about a medical crisis that would lead a younger generation to have distrust of science? I have to admit, I'm
Mhm.
still baffled by that, and it plays into what we're talking about.
Yeah. Um, I don't think the reaction against science was inevitable, and nor do I think it necessarily makes sense. I think science overall, the medical establishment did a pretty good job. I'm speaking personally here. I personally think they did a pretty good job of handling a situation that was
Yeah.
uncertain. But that said, from the perception of someone who was, say, in middle school or very early high school at that time, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about the young Gen Zers who are now in college, they would have seen uh, mandates changing. This week you're told uh, masks are just for medical personnel. Next week you're told, no, you have to wear a mask. And then now you're told uh, you have to get a vaccine and the vaccine will keep you safe. And then after that, no, go back to wearing a mask again.
Yeah.
It went back and forth. And so obviously there was some uncertainty on the part of the medical establishment. It also seemed, I think, to many people who lived through it as young people, that the whole thing was sort of like a game of Russian roulette. There were people who were vaccinated, especially elderly people, who died anyway. There were people who were not vaccinated and did just fine. But all in all, because of the warnings of the establishment, many people who lived through that as middle schoolers or high schoolers had to spend months, maybe even up to a year or more, in some degree of social isolation from their peers. And I think that took a toll on them. And so it was therefore easier for them to believe uh, either outright conspiracy theories about COVID, or at the very least, uh, to be open to the idea that the establishment failed them,
Mm.
especially now that they feel like their job prospects are not particularly high, and that they feel like something has been lost in their lives. So, in the context of all of that, I think some people are looking for a source of moral authority that's unchanging. And the forms of Christianity that appeal to Gen Zers tend to be those forms of Christianity that have a strong sense of moral authority opposed to the establishment. So especially the Catholic Church, but among some Gen Zers, and particularly those who maybe are lower income or people of color, there's also been a gravitation toward uh, charismatic forms of Christianity. That Pentecostalism is on the rise in the United States, and that too has a very anti-establishment but certain source of moral authority. The moral authority in the individual leadings of the Holy Spirit and the prophetic utterances. And so, as I look at that, and I see that the forms of Christianity that have uh, rooted their source of moral authority more in terms of the collective lived experience of the church, the liberal Protestant denominations, those denominations seem to be gaining very few Gen Z adherents. They're not benefiting at all from the Gen Z revival, as far as I can tell from the statistics and from the anecdotal information that I've gathered. And so that would imply to me that this religious revival is coupled with an unusually high gravitation uh, toward sources of moral authority that are different from that of conventional American liberalism.
And that leads us to a name that you brought up very early on in our discussion, and we haven't come back to until now, but I think this is the time to come back to it. And that leads us to Donald Trump, who does have a huge following among, maybe surprising to some, Gen Zers. And that puzzles many. And I think to some degree it puzzles me. But is it because he is perceived to be, and I've gotten tired, I used to say he had authoritarian tendencies. I've gotten tired of saying that, frankly. I think it's pretty clear that he is an authoritarian by just his makeup. I think that's where he goes politically. Uh, does that tie in his support among that subset of Americans to this religious revival?
Yes, uh, I I'll have to admit as well that uh, 9 years ago, when he was first elected, I had not expected him to get support from young people. And in fact, the conventional wisdom among uh, pundits and political scientists in late 2016 was that his coalition actually was forged from an older demographic, primarily a demographic that was disappearing. But obviously, things have changed in 9 years, and I think that he has branded himself with a form of personal charisma that actually dovetails quite well with the charisma of certain religious leaders, especially in the Pentecostal wing of American Christianity. And I think it's no surprise that some of his earliest uh, alliances with Christian leaders were formed with Pentecostals, like Paula White, for example, during his first term. Uh, Beyond that, I think he is a symbol of power. He is a symbol of uh, iconoclasm for people who are looking for someone who will smash the established institutions and uh, lead America into something completely new. Uh, he is that figure, and so the Gen Zers who oppose him tend to be Gen Zers who are committed to the principles of multicultural equality. Either that's based on um, gender equality or it's based on racial equality or both, but they continue to believe in that traditional aspect of the liberal vision that the Democratic Party has embraced for decades and that was supposed to be pretty pervasive among younger people, I thought, during the Obama years, for example, and I had assumed that was continuing. But I think for the Gen Zers who oppose that, which is it's still a minority of Gen Zers, but it's a very large minority compared to what we might expect. That that large minority of Gen Zers who have gravitated toward Trump and who do identify with the Republican Party are people who very firmly reject uh, the the liberal vision of pluralism and multicultural equality, and instead are attracted by a strong leader, a strong man, we could say. And so Trump's authoritarian uh, personality or authoritarian actions actually solidifies support among the group of Americans, a sizable group of Americans who are attracted to that, and that includes Gen Zers. And so, traditionally, with young people in American history, we have generally seen the tendency to gravitate toward extremes, toward something that is not quite so nuanced, and toward a populist anti-establishment figure. So we could see that in the late 60s with the New Left. We could see that in the support of the excitement of a lot of Gen Xers toward the Reagan Revolution in the early 1980s. And we could see that in 2008 with Obama, who was a remarkably establishment figure, but his image in 2008 was as a fresh face, as someone who offered something new, certainly something very different from what George W. Bush and the Republican Party seemed to be offering at that time. And so in every case, we could see the attraction of young people toward that type of a figure. And then even with figures who haven't necessarily won the nomination of their party, or both on the right and on the left, people like Ron Paul in the early 2000s, people like Ralph Nader, people like more recently Bernie Sanders. All of these people enjoyed pretty high support, unusually high support from young people. And so as an anti-establishment figure, I think Donald Trump has developed a following among young people that maybe the pundits didn't really expect.
What happens when the time comes, and it will, when Donald Trump leaves the public stage? What happens to those young people, young males in particular, who have drifted into a very conservative form of Christianity and have somehow linked that to a strongman type, Donald Trump. What happens when he eventually leaves? Where do they go?
Yeah. Well, traditionally, uh, in American history over the last 90 years, people's first votes, that is, in their first election cycle when they enter the electorate after the age of 18, uh, that influences their political choices for a long time to come. So for the generation of Americans who are now almost all deceased, but the generation of Americans who first started voting during the era of Franklin Roosevelt and cast their first ballots for FDR, they remained Democrats right into the end of the 20th century in many cases. Similarly, for the young Americans at the time in 1980 and 1984, people who were born in the early 1960s, they remained more Republican than people who were either 10 years older or 10 years younger throughout their voting lives. So if historical patterns are any guide to the present, we could say that this generation is likely to continue to be affected by the choices they make now. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't change over time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will remain as religiously fervent in the future as they are today, or even that they will continue to identify with conservative Christianity. And of course, some may well leave the Republican Party altogether. But historically, we could say that the choices people make as college students and as young people in the realm of politics and religion really do affect their thinking through the rest of their lives. Now, uh, the political moment we're in, as you know, is very different in some ways from previous political moments, and there are a lot of unknowns. There's a great unknown as to what the Republican Party will become. What will uh, what will American politics look like after Trump? Will the Republican Party continue to champion the same sorts of things? Will the whole movement implode? I mean, there are so many possibilities, and I guess that's probably a much larger conversation than what we might have time for today. But I would say that regardless of what happens in the future, I would look for a through line from the choices people are making today to the actions that they'll likely take a few years from now.
And where does, in your view, that through line take us as a country?
I think it takes us toward continued polarization. So just a few years ago, in fact, even only 2 or 3 years ago, many people were predicting that the Christian right would eventually uh, meet its demise simply through demographic change. That as America became less religious, the minority of Americans who remained conservative Christians would be too small to affect the political process. But I think in reality, with the Gen Z revival, we have the possibility in place for a continued culture war for possibly even decades to come. Now, obviously, that any prediction that goes for decades in time assumes uh, that things continue on their present course, and that's probably never a safe assumption.
Mhm.
But uh, given what we see now, I think we're likely to continue to debate abortion, continue to debate sexuality, continue to debate the place of religion in public life in ways that can be very politically polarizing. Beyond that, what I would say is because this Gen Z religious revival is still taking place among a minority of Gen Zers, though it is a very strong minority, those Gen Zers who have bought into the movement are going to have to face a choice sooner or later, which is perhaps the choice between losing under a system of democratic pluralism, or potentially winning under a less democratic system. And that's the choice that I think probably would alarm most people who are looking on with some degree of apprehension. It's one thing to have a religious revival, even a religious revival with political overtones, but it's another thing to see the religious revival with political overtones gravitating so strongly toward political movements that openly flirt with non-democratic means of maintaining control, and to realize that actually, in all likelihood, that may be the only or the safest way for that group to maintain their control of the political process. And that, I think, for a lot of Gen Zers who have become both conservative Christians and conservative Republicans, they haven't perhaps necessarily thought about the implications of what it will mean to be a minority religious group in the future. Are they willing to be a minority in a larger pluralistic system in order to give way to the majority of the electorate, or would they rather take power in some non-democratic way?
Daniel K. Williams, Associate Professor of History at Ashland University, thank you very much for taking part in this episode of SOS America. And for those of you who are watching or listening, as always, we certainly welcome your comments. If you would like to subscribe, it is free, so by all means, we encourage you to do so. Until the next episode of SOS America, I'm Charles Feldman. Thank you.